You can also do that in the car, get your socks and shoes.
Hello, I should be able to see you now.
All right.
Let's see. So
it says
we have 4 panelists.
Hello.
it says that I can't start the video because you've stopped it.
It says the same to me.
Okay. Let's see what I can do about that.
I got the same message, Gary.
Yeah. A co-host. Yes. All right. A co-host. Yes.
Not only that, my picture doesn't come up.
It should now.
There it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, ladies.
Hello.
Hello. Well, that's working. Let's see.
I'm going to clear some kipple off of my.
Let's also try to see if you can share a screen.
Yes, good idea. Oh, share.
Not chat. Share screen is the green thing.
I got it.
It looks like somebody's sharing a screen.
That's me.
Okay,
good.
That's good.
Alex, do we need to make sure that I can
I just-
manipulate it?
Yes. So if you click.
Okay, so it's not, that may be something that Gary has to set up, no?
That's something that I need to set up, and
Oh,
now you
okay.
can control my screen.
It's not. It says it's controlling it, but then
It's
nothing's.
It's controlling it. I'm seeing it change. Are you not
Well,
seeing
now-
it change?
Okay, it took a second,
Okay.
but it now is. And are you going to switch back and forth between the two of us, or am I always going to be able to control it?
You're always going to be able to control it. That's how things worked when we were doing this on Friday.
Yes. Good evening, everybody. I am Gary Berg-Cross. I am the president of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Conference, which holds the annual F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Festival. And part of our festival activities is to celebrate Scott Fitzgerald's birthday. We're doing it a little bit late because our main events were a little bit earlier in late September, but we are very happy to be able to have one of 2 of our online celebrations of Fitzgerald. We have one in the fall, and we have one in May. And so stay tuned in the future for announcements about when that will be in May and who will be featured. You can see more information about that and other activities of the festival at our website, which is fitzgeraldfestival.com. So I want to introduce one of our committee members, who is also a Fitzgerald scholar, Eleanor Higginbottom, who will say a few words and introduce today's talk and the speakers. So with that, let me turn it over to Eleanor.
Good evening. At least on the East Coast, it's a beautiful, crisp fall evening, just the kind Fitzgerald would have put in a story, I think. I am Eleanor Higginbotham, substituting for Jackson Breyer, who was originally going to do this. Some of you I know from my former teaching in St. Paul. I hope there's some friends from that group. where I passed Fitzgerald's birthplace on the way to work every day. Others I know from my Maryland life, where I live a few miles down the pike from the Fitzgerald grave, which is the reason we have the Rockville Conference here, the celebration. I'm grateful to Jackson for the opportunity to learn about this really major contribution to Fitzgerald scholarship by the two women, the two scholars to whom I'm about to introduce you. Though the cover of their collection, The Complete Magazine Stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald, 1921 to 1924, says, editors, they are much more than collectors, arrangers, and footnoters. Their research into Fitzgerald's career, an amazing one, I think, for a young man still under 30, by the final publication of this volume, amounts to new fields of inquiry and what had seemed to be a thoroughly documented and analyzed body of texts already. So why do we need a new edition? Well, some of the editors of other volumes of stories may come on board here. I hope they will. You know, Kirk and Dave, and maybe even James L. West, whose Cambridge editions these editors call unparalleled. These scholars have a different mission from those editors. Accustomed as we are to reading the stories arranged thematically and with interpretations, this volume's focus is on the culture of the inception of the stories, 18 of them arranged in the order of their presentation in 9 different magazines. Their historical context is rendered as purely as this kind of print publication manage. Can't be the magazine, but it can do a very good job with replicating it. With many of the original illustrations and other evidences of the material culture in which they were composed and read, ads for mouthwash, hand drills, rugs, and so forth. The remarkable appendices attached don't interrupt the stories. The stories are pure, virginal in a way, as they would have been read. But remarkably, the collection of indices and the wonderful introduction, it's almost a separate and worthy monograph in itself, and just fascinating. They describe and chart these ancillary contextual accompaniments to the stories. So they put us back in time. But the volume also leads us into the future, means of inquiry into the language, slang, and song lyrics and so forth by way of engrams, for which the discoveries are so much fun and so complex that I'll let Alexandra Mitchell explain it all. So finally, let me introduce Alexandra Mitchell, who spent a decade collecting the complete short stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Her use of digital humanities techniques to illuminate the historical context, while it has limitations, and I'm sure she'll talk about them because some of them are funny, and she can explain that, it's surely a new avenue of exploration for any author's use of language in that author's own time. So I can imagine this going backward and forward with so many authors to do this. She'll show you the graphs, I hope. Very complicated and interesting. She's joining us. You're in England, right, Alexandra? But
That's right, in London.
Your degree is from Glasgow in information technology, your master's degree. Her colleague, Jennifer Nolan, is associate professor of English at North Carolina State University, so she hasn't had an easy week. This past one in that storm-ravaged state. She was the program director of the 2017 Fitzgerald Society Conference in St. Paul. I co-chaired the arrangements for the first of those in St. Paul in 2002, so I know how hard and how rewarding that was. She's a board member of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society and has published extensively on the periodical context of Fitzgerald's short stories, including in the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies, and of course, the best place for these things, the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review. She provided the remarkable introduction, which is, as I say, worthy of a monograph in itself, I think. and the appendices. Now, what the appendices show us is some of the art, and there are a bunch of artists, really wonderful artists, Arthur William Brown, Charles Mitchell, and so forth, but also the popular culture of the 1920s, Fitzgerald's savvy manipulation of the market, his relationship with his editors, and the stories themselves. Most of them, but not all, well known, at least to me, but some of them not well known. I Braggs Martin Jones and the Prince of Wales, for example. This is not what I don't know, but about what they do. So they'll take over now and speak as they wish. We're going to do this for about 40 minutes. And then we hope you'll have lots of questions. I will gather them, harvest them from the Q&A. So if you have a question, please write it there. And at the end of that period, we'll introduce some questions and answers, which I'm sure, of which there will be a lot, I'm sure. So, Jennifer and Alexandra, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Ellie, for that introduction and for highlighting some of the features of our edition. Before we begin, Alex and I also want to express our thanks to Jackson Breyer, to Gary Berg-Cross, and to everyone affiliated with the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Festival for inviting us to belatedly celebrate F. Scott Fitzgerald's birthday with you. As Sarah Churchwell has pointed out, we have the Jazz Age to thank for the terms mass market and mass media, first recorded in 1922 and 1923, respectively. Tellingly, the word mass media was not created to describe the nascent film industry, as we might think, but rather to describe, quote, advertising for popular magazines. It is no exaggeration to say that during the Jazz Age, the popular magazine market held the power and influence to change a writer's life virtually overnight, as is the case for young F. Scott Fitzgerald as he began his career. Yet even among those who understand that Fitzgerald is more than simply the author of The Great Gatsby, as those of you listening, the role of the magazines in his career is still understudied and underappreciated. Our book series, which will eventually reprint the text of every magazine story Fitzgerald published in the order they appeared in the marketplace, along with the contextual information that Ellie alluded to and the images, seeks to restore the magazines to their rightful place in Fitzgerald's legacy. For it was in these spaces and pages where he reached his largest audiences and built his reputation and career. So to understand the role of magazines for Fitzgerald and in American literature more broadly in this era, we must begin with an understanding of the Jazz Age magazine market itself, which differs in fundamental ways from the magazine landscape of the second half of the 20th century and beyond that many of us are much more familiar with. However, this world is not so far removed as it may first seem, because in some ways, with the rise of streaming services, we've returned to a mass communication style much more reminiscent of this period than the network era that came between. So, much like our streaming service subscriptions today, families would subscribe to magazines, like the Saturday Evening Post, which were full of different types of materials. So, of course, there's fiction in their illustrations. There's political editorials and nonfiction articles. And there are the advertisements that paid for it all. And each of these features appealed to different members of the household who shared the magazine, much like we do our Netflix passwords. And just as we now have a plethora of viewing options and streaming services to appeal to different audiences, readers not only had their pick of content, but also an array of magazines from which to find their entertainment. As seen on this slide that includes every magazine that Fitzgerald published in during the Jazz Age, or to center Fitzgerald, a scale to indicate the influence of each in his career during this period, with the magazines on the right being those where he published 1 or 2 times, and the Post far surpassing them all, with 33 stories appearing there by the end of 1929, by which time he was paid the remarkable sum of $4,000 per story, which in and of itself, according to my students, would be an incredible amount for a single story. But when we put that in today's dollars, is roughly equivalent to over $70,000 a story. Thus, unlike today, where we encounter Fitzgerald short stories and a book of other stories, or perhaps, and a few of them in one of the many editions of The Great Gatsby that have proliferated since that novel went into the public domain, or if in class in an anthology of American literature. And what unifies all of these is that Fitzgerald's text in each of them are surrounded primarily by other fiction. In contrast, most of Fitzgerald's readers found his stories surrounded by other materials that both directly and indirectly shaped the way that they were received. It will perhaps come as little surprise to this audience that from the beginning of his career, Fitzgerald was as adept at reading and navigating the Jazz Age magazine market as he was at reading and navigating the Jazz Age itself. In September of 1920, a week after the publication of his first book of short stories, Flappers and Philosophers, all of which, it should be noted, had been originally published in either the Smart Set, the Saturday Evening Post, or Scribner's Magazine, Fitzgerald was featured in Who's Who and Why, which was a Saturday Evening Post series that introduced readers to up-and-coming names whose work was appearing in their pages. In this mildly self-deprecating autobiography, Fitzgerald recounts his journey to becoming a famous author, including the dark period in 1919 where he worked in advertising by day and wrote stories by night that no one wanted. And the quote there is, "I had 122 rejection slips printed in a frieze about my room," pinned in a frieze. While this image is generally read to provide contrast to the almost overnight success that Fitzgerald had following his return home to St. Paul in July 1919, the sheer volume of rejection slips, along with his display of them, suggests the seriousness with which he approached writing for the magazines. This point is borne out in his letters with Harold Ober, his literary agent, who was responsible for placing and selling his work in the period when This Side of Paradise and the stories referred to here had been accepted but not yet published. In the January 1920 letter quoted on the left, we see Fitzgerald working through how best to support and promote himself as a professional writer, and his recognition that publication in the popular magazines was central to this goal. So he says, "I doubt if, as a whole, my novels would stand much chance of being published serially, at least until my first novel and these Post stories appear, and I get some sort of reputation." With a weekly circulation of over 2 million in 1919, when Fitzgerald received his first acceptance for Head and Shoulders, publication in the Post had the power to make him a household name, and did. As Leon Wuppel would put it in his 1928 biography of the magazine Mirror of These States, who reads the Post? Who looks in the mirror? Everybody. Highbrow, lowbrow, and mezzanine. On the other hand, in the postscript to another letter written to Ober a few weeks later about additional stories for the Post, Fitzgerald acknowledges that money and vast audiences alone would not provide the prestige he also desired as a writer. Quote, "I want to keep Enright with Mencken and Nathan, the editors of the Smart Set, as they're the most powerful critics in the country. As Sharon Hamilton has established, such an impulse provided prescient, placing Fitzgerald's early Smart Set stories before the right group of people at the right time. So that when This Side of Paradise came out, urbane and sophisticated audiences were predisposed to view the novel through the lens of a, quote, magazine known for its ability to spot talent, its willingness to promote material that took risk in style and subject matter, and its appeal to American youth. Add to this Mencken's glowing review of the novel in the August 1920 Smart Set, which provided Fitzgerald with much needed cultural cachet, and it becomes clear how integral the magazines were in his reputation as a novelist as well. Fitzgerald's positioning himself as a young writer, as I have just laid out, will form the basis of the next volume in our series.
Before we go deeper into Fitzgerald's magazine work, though, I'd like to share the story of how this project started. And you probably are wondering how I got here. I am not an academic. I have an office job. So I'd like to share a little bit about the genesis of this project. And it starts almost 2 decades ago, in 2005, when I set myself the task to, in 1 year, read the complete prose fiction of F. Scott Fitzgerald. I started with the novels, which is, if not an easy project, a bounded one. You buy 5 books, perhaps in a handsome edition like this one. But then I came to the short stories. So of course I knew about the big collections. I knew that Fitzgerald had written for his school and for his college magazines. I knew he'd written some stories with Zelda, some stories about recurring characters, that there are volumes that seem to exist to collect up stories not in other volumes. But still, every book of Scott Fitzgerald's short stories that I bought seemed to have stories in it that weren't in any of the others. So I did perhaps the last normal thing I would do in this entire project. I gave up. But then in 2010, something else happened. This was a time of real optimism about the internet and about what digital technology could do for us. And one of those digital technologies was print on demand. So you see here the artist James Bridle's project to print out 3 years of Wikipedia changelogs on the Wikipedia entry for the Iraq War. He used a printing press, a self-publishing platform called lulu.com. And it reminded me that I had a project that a self-publishing platform could really help with. I'd wanted to read the complete stories, short stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and now it seemed I had the technology to do this. I think I had this idea that I could just copy paste them all off the internet and that there would be about 50 of them. So what you see here is an artist's impression of me copy pasting 50 short stories. We're all Fitzgerald fans here. You already know there's not at all 50 stories, and you can see all the space on the slide. So a lot of these stories are available on the internet. Laxer copyright regimes in the UK and in Australia meant that 159 were available online. A further 39, though, were only available in books. I would need to find some way of digitizing them. And finally, there were 3 only available in the Library of Congress. To a total of, by my calculation, 183 short stories. So I'd understated the amount of work this would take by a factor of at least 3. But at this point, I'd had my vision of what I wanted to do. I really wanted now to read the complete short stories of Scott Fitzgerald, and I was going to do it. So I started copying stories out of books. This actually took so long that technology developed to a point where OCR, where optical character recognition, could help me would make this a bit of an easier project. And yes, I went to the Library of Congress for those 3 stories that weren't available anywhere else. And it's at the Library of Congress that something else changed for me, because I had been thinking of these stories as something that came from books, as something that should be in books. But holding this magazine, this very everyday object, that if it hadn't been in the Library of Congress, would have been thrown in the trash decades ago, would have lined the cage of the guinea pig. It changed how I thought about those stories and about their presentation. And so did the fact that the magazines themselves were degrading. They were ripped, there were words missing from some of the stories because of that. So in 2023, my and Jennifer's volume came out, the first volume in our series, really focusing on and foregrounding not only the magazine texts, but what surrounded those magazine texts as well. I'm going to show you an example. So here's a story that we've heard a little bit about already, Rags Martin Jones and the Prince of Wales. We see this illustration of Rags having her photo taken with her parrot. And we also see some slightly breathless paratext where the magazine is telling its reader what to expect from this story. The writer who discovered the flapper tells how one of them acts when she meets a real prince in this, one of the best love stories of the day. And in our volume, we show you that as well. We show you what magazine the story was printed in, when it was printed, what Fitzgerald was paid for it, and how the editors told you to receive that story. Because magazines not only printed Fitzgerald's stories, they told their readers how to understand them. We preserve that context so that you can experience not only the stories, but also how Fitzgerald's contemporaries were told to read them.
So returning to Fitzgerald's navigation through the magazine network of his day, following the publication of The Beautiful and Damned in 1922, which itself was conceived from the outset as a serial for the ill-fated Metropolitan and ran in that magazine from September 1921 to March 1922, as we see here, Fitzgerald entered into a period where he published more broadly within the field of periodicals than at any other point in his career, which is why we chose this period for the beginning of our series. After his contract with Metropolitan ended, when the magazine went into receivership, much to Fitzgerald's relief, as their financial troubles had made it difficult for him to receive payment, and despite some hesitation on his part, he entered into what would be his final contract, this time with the Hearst magazine empire. Though this relationship began with great fanfare, leading off his debut issue in the May of 1923 issue with the famous Alfred Cheney Johnston photograph of Scott and Zelda that you see there on the left, Fitzgerald chafed against the restrictions and consistency that being a contract writer placed on him. And it culminated in, to use Fitzgerald's words, a grand fight with Hovey, Hovey being the editor of Hearst International, which resulted in the return of 2 of Fitzgerald's stories and a seeming recognition by Fitzgerald that he was not cut out to be a contract writer, as he would never become one again. Freed from the restrictions of contracts at last, at no other time during his career did Fitzgerald traverse and play with and within the Jazz Age periodical network more than the mid-1920s, as we see here, clearly explaining in his letters to Harold Ober which magazines he felt were most appropriate for which of his stories. Fitzgerald and Ober's command of this market is impressive and amply evidenced. Perhaps none more fortuitously than in his placement of one of the stories Hearst returned to Fitzgerald at the conclusion of his contract, the aforementioned Jones and the Prince of Wales, which was placed in the women's magazine, McCall's. So we are well aware that, like Ellie, much of our audience is probably not familiar with this story. So to give you a little bit of an overview, in Fitzgerald's story, Rags Martin Jones, a world-weary, outrageously rich orphan whose parents died on the Titanic, has returned to her native New York after 2 years abroad and immediately laments returning, claiming, quote, "No Americans have any imagination." Chased by men due to her wealth and beauty and little else, Rags has all but given up on finding a man who can actually interest her until John M. Chestnut puts on an elaborate scheme involving the purported Prince of Wales and a murder and wins her over. And that's all you need to know at this point. As one of the first media celebrities and the world's most eligible bachelors, the Prince of Wales' second visit to America in the fall of 1924, after a 5-year hiatus, was much anticipated. And McCall's ran a cluster of stories on him in response. Nor was McCall's alone in this intensive focus on the prince. At the conclusion of his 1924 visit, the press clippings for his 3-week holiday in New York contained 61,120 items in all, weighing 325 pounds. This amount of press clippings was surpassed in volume only by the press generated from Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927. Thus, in both the subject of his story and in the placement of it in McCall's, Fitzgerald incisively read and reflected his era, a point drawn out by returning the story to the print context of his day. By the middle of the 1920s, Red Book became the place Fitzgerald sent his more serious work, those his words, while he began sending his weakest works to the Woman's Home Companion. While this distinction may seem strange to modern audiences who know of Red Book as a woman's magazine as well, in the 1920s, Red Book's focus was almost exclusively on fiction, and they billed themselves as, this is their title, the largest illustrated fiction magazine in the world. The distinction that Fitzgerald drew between these two sources is clear in letters that he wrote to Ober about Not in the Guidebook, which was published in the Woman's Home Companion in November of 1925, and perhaps his least favorite story, Your Way and Mine, which was published there in the May 1927 issue. In the first of these letters, we see Fitzgerald's hierarchy. He doesn't want Not in the Guidebook to be sent to the post because of how many people will see it there, nor to Red Book as his outlet for his more serious work. So he says, good stories write themselves. Bad ones have to be written, so this took up about 3 weeks. And look at it. I'd rather not offer it to the post because everybody sees the post. But I know it's saleable and I need the money. I leave it to you. The Red Book story will be along shortly. For God's sake, don't give them this. His letter regarding Your Way and Mine is even more emphatic about where the story should not be sent, which is conveyed visually as well as textually. This is one of the lousiest stories I've ever written. Just terrible. Please, and I mean this, don't offer it to the post. I think that as things are now, it would be wretched policy. Nor to the Red Book. It hasn't one redeeming touch of my usual spirit in it. I'd rather have $1,000 for it from some obscure place than twice that and have it seen. I feel very strongly about this. So I want to reiterate here that none of this emphasis is mine. This is all Fitzgerald's. And his comments about Redbook and the Post reflect both the relationships that he's built with each of those magazines and his understanding of the impact to his reputation of having his inferior work be seen by their audiences. And yet, in 1927, when this story was published, the Woman's Home Companion was far from, to use Fitzgerald's words, some obscure place, having reached a readership of 2 million in that year. So certainly his story would be seen. The question is by whom? As for all of the stories in the middle, these were sent to the Post, which had achieved a weekly readership of 2.5 million people by the time Fitzgerald returned to it in 1924.
Jennifer's just shown how well Fitzgerald read the magazine market, and now I'm excited to show you how well he read his own popular culture. This was recognized at the time. In this review of This Side of Paradise, the reviewer writes that Mr. Fitzgerald has all the small talk of undergraduates and the flapper at his fingers' ends. It's always been known that he chronicled the language of his day, but now, using the technology of today, we can see exactly how accurate he was. I use a technology called Google Ngram. What Google Ngram does is measures the concentration of a word or a phrase in a corpus of text. This corpus is made up of the books, the magazines, and the newspapers of the day. And it gives you a sense of what was important at that time. It's probably easiest to show an example. So here's an example using the word flapper. You see the usage of this word picked up a bit in the early 1910s, but it's in 1920 and thereafter that we see that characteristic hockey stick growth, followed by a decline from 1923. And of course, it was in 1920 that Fitzgerald's short story collection, Flappers and Philosophers, was brought to market by Scribner's. So here we see Fitzgerald not only reflecting, but creating the linguistic fashions of his day. He also, with a high degree of accuracy, called the end of the word flapper with, in 1922, the year before the peak, in Tales of the Jazz Age, dedicating a section of that book to my last flappers. Now, it's important to know, before we go into any more examples like this one, that Google Ngram is not perfect. There are 3 really important caveats that I want to talk about before we look at any more graphs together. Firstly, and obviously, it's a record of the printed word. It's not really small talk. The printed word will lag the spoken word to some degree, so it's always going to be slightly inaccurate. Secondly, OCR errors are persistent. They're predictable, but they always show up in very consistent ways. Robots are simply not that great at reading. The word close is almost always rendered as dose. The word morn is nearly always rendered as mom. Finally, and I think most importantly, homonyms are meaningless without context. This might seem like an obvious point. I'd like to show another graph to really bring it home. At the time of our volume, Fitzgerald really liked calling people egg. There's a story called The Unspeakable Egg. Plenty of characters refer to one another as a good egg. Naturally, it was my instinct to make a graph out of that. And it looked like, although this had some popularity, perhaps rising popularity in the 20s, use of the phrase good egg really peaked in 1934. I looked at this and I thought, well, perhaps Fitzgerald was ahead of his time in using that phrase. Then I looked at what articles made up this corpus, and I found information about the efficiency of commercial egg handling, and articles from the Farmer's Bulletin in the Yearbook of Agriculture. And then that spike in 1934 becomes much clearer, because of course this was the time of the Dust Bowl and the Depression, and there was a natural interest by everyone in agricultural production. Having looked at those limitations, let's have a look at what the data tells us. Now, as I've said before, I work in an office, and I'm very interested in this question of what businessmen did in the 1920s. I want to start with a quotation from The Popular Girl. This is a quotation about Jerry O'Rourke, one of several unremarkable young men who's pursuing the heroine. He sold bonds. Bonds were now the thing. Real estate was once the thing. In a story written in 1921 and published in 1922. When we map the phrase sell real estate against sell bonds, we see that the year this story was written was a year after the first time sell bonds surpassed sell real estate in the popular culture for the first time in Fitzgerald's lifetime. He had that close of a view on what was happening in his own culture that he could call this shift almost exactly as it happened. Similarly, in His Russet Witch, we read that Arthur was gone into Wall Street to sell bonds, as all young men seemed to be in that day. Written in 1920, published in 1921. And of course, in 1920, the phrase sell bonds was at a high never seen before in Fitzgerald's lifetime. It probably did feel like that was what all young men were doing. In 1922, in Winter Dreams, the situation's changed just slightly. Dexter says of the people around him, all around him, rich men's sons were peddling bonds precariously. Get that idea of precarity, that idea of peddling. Suddenly, this doesn't look like the dream stable career that perhaps Arthur and Jerry thought it was going to be. And indeed, that comment is written in a lull, a little bit before a much bigger dip in the cachet of the idea of selling bonds. Of course, my and Jennifer's focus in this volume is on the short stories, but it would be neglectful not to mention that Nick Carraway, too, sold bonds. Very early in Gatsby, he says, "Everyone I knew was in the bond business, so I suppose it could support one more single man." In this book, set in 1922, but published in 1925. And from the vantage point of 1925, well, it looks like maybe that business couldn't support one more single man. But absolutely, when it was set in 1922, we can almost imagine Nick Carraway as a colleague of Arthur Granger, of Jerry O'Rourke, of Dexter's contemporaries. So now we know what businessmen did in the 1920s. They sold bonds. But how did they talk? I want to start with Roscoe Button, the bumptious son of the hero of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, written and published in 1922. In the idiom of his generation, Roscoe did not consider the matter, that's the matter of his father aging backwards, efficient. Keep that in mind. Now, in The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, John T. Unger imagines businessmen saying, "I've been pretty busy installing a new triple efficiency system," in a story written in 1921 and published in 1922. As you can see, the word efficient was declining a little bit by the time these characters spoke. It's interesting to look into the history, though, of the word efficient in American culture, how this came about. So you'll see there's an increase in from 1911. And that really starts with Frank Galbraith's really groundbreaking time and motion studies. We really still live in the shadow of these studies, and they increased the interest of the press and of magazines in the idea of efficiency. Probably the war years sustained this as well. But it's on the wane a little bit. By the time John T. Younger imagines these men speaking, by the time Roscoe is complaining about his father. These men, they are not innovators. They are using a concept that is, it's still got some cachet. We actually see that in an advert in Collier's right next to the curious case of Benjamin Button, where Eversharp advertised the pencil of business efficiency. But these men are not coming up with new ideas on what it is to run a business. They are followers, not leaders. It tells us something about the characters. Now, I'm going to return to Roscoe Button, who is an absolute gift to an analysis like this one. He speaks in nothing but cliches strung together. Here we see him thinking, it seemed to him that his father, in refusing to look 60, had not behaved like a red-blooded he-man. Let's look at that word, he-man. Because Roscoe Button might not have been an innovator in business, but he absolutely uses this word in the middle of its meteoric rise, halted seemingly only by the advent of the Depression in 1929. We also see this word confirmed by the advertisements in Collier's, where Durham Duplex advertise the razor for he-men right next to the curious case of Benjamin Button. We all know that Fitzgerald both recorded and popularized his generation's idioms. We've seen it in contemporary reviews. We've seen it in the contemporary culture, in the adverts and the texts around these stories. And for the first time, we can see it in the numbers. Over to you, Jennifer.
My apologies. I had to mute my video for just a second, and the ability to unmute it seems to not be. There we go. Sorry about that. One of the remaining features of the magazine landscape that gets lost in contemporary reproductions are the visual elements. Perhaps most significantly, the illustrations that were created to accompany literary text. For readers of the day, these were central to their experience of the text, not incidental, but essential. And their impressions were influenced and guided by the illustrations that accompanied them. For Fitzgerald's magazine audiences, the experience of both text and image happened simultaneously, and often the visual representation of a character or of a scene preceded the textual description. Such was the case when Mae Wilson Preston, named one of the best illustrators in the world in 1915 by Vanity Fair, illustrated one of Fitzgerald's early stories to appear in the Post, Bernice Bobs Her Hair, in 1920. As we can see from this image of the first page, it was her picture of Bernice that readers first encountered and thus took into the story with them, guided by a knowledge of her reputation for deft characterization and her support for women's suffrage. The first two pages of the story faced each other. And as was the usual format, an opening illustration was centered just below the title and another depicting a later moment in the story at the bottom of the facing page. In this instance, both images foreground Bernice. In the first, we see her awkwardly holding her fan to create almost a barrier of sorts between herself and the arrogant young man leaning aggressively toward her. And in the second, she's surrounded by a group of surprised and angry onlookers as she asks the barber to bob her hair in the penultimate scene. And both of these images, importantly, are proleptic, in that a reader's first experience of each scene would be in Preston's illustrations and not in Fitzgerald's text. Restoring Preston's compelling and complex portraits of Bernice navigating her way through the tumultuous and shifting expectations for young womanhood that arose rapidly post-war is essential for understanding how Bernice bobs her hair helped to establish Fitzgerald's reputation as the voice of jazz-age youth. And while we unfortunately cannot reprint every illustration, drawing attention to the visual context and the ways that shaped readers' experiences, while providing a glimpse into how it looked, begins the process of restoring this important work and of understanding how literature was read and understood in this period. This visual context is and will continue to be emphasized in our volumes in each of my introductions and in the inclusion of an image appendix, as Ellie noted, that includes both covers and story illustrations, as well as advertisements and other features. Likewise, the cultural context is and will continue to be emphasized in our volumes through my introduction, through an appendix including an engram analysis of keywords, as Alex has given us a glimpse into today, and by inviting scholars to write prefaces that will further expand upon different elements of this cultural background.
Our goal is to print a complete series of Fitzgerald's commercial fiction with the context Jennifer has spoken about, so that readers of today, so that you can experience and understand these stories as contemporary readers would have done. Our next volume is going to focus on 1919 and 1920, and we're really excited to share with you more of Fitzgerald's very first commercial fiction, beyond the highlights you've seen today. Thank you for your time, everyone. We're also excited to take your questions.
Yes, I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but I have plenty. I thought this was such a treat, in addition to reading what you sent me already. And congratulations on the fact that this will come out in paperback in, I think you said, in the spring, so that every serious Fitzgerald reader can add it to the collection and see these fascinating appendices and read the purity of the stories as they were read. I love the I love putting the story back into the context of the original reader, not 100 years hence, with all the accompanying knowledge that we have of the author. This is very, very pure. Jennifer, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the influence and the interference or pressure that Ober added to Fitzgerald's, connections for money. I noticed that a story that is the most familiar, probably, or one of the most anthologized and famous stories of the 18 in your volume, A Diamond as Big as the Ritz, earned only $300 in Smart Set in 1922. By 1924, the Post offered $1,750 for a story that is not talked about so much, The Unspeakable Egg. So there's a sort of quality and cost balance happening here. Was Ober influential in upping that cost, or what happened? And it was just the fame of Fitzgerald himself and the fact that the serialization of another novel was going on.
Well, Fitzgerald, found that fact that you just pointed out, that he was only paid $300 for The Diamond as Big as his Ritz, frustrating. He, in fact, wrote about his frustration with that to Ober, because he wrote The Popular Girl around the same time and was paid, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, Alexandra, $1,500 for that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the issue is not over. The issue is the magazine market more broadly. And the fact that the type of story that Diamond is one that is less likely to be published in a space like the Saturday Evening Post that pays really the top prices during that period. So the Post fancied itself as a reflection on American ideals and morals. And with that came restrictions on the type of things that it was willing to publish, both in terms of experimentation with style, which we definitely see in that story, but also in terms of subject matter. And so Ober would send these stories where Fitzgerald was asking him to, but that doesn't mean that the place that they were originally sent was where they ended up being published. So, you know, going back to Rags Martin Jones, it was returned by Metropolitan and initially sent to the Post, and the Post said, no, thank you. So so really it's the editorial hand there determining what's appropriate for which magazine, as much as it is Ober or even Fitzgerald. What Ober and Fitzgerald did well was understanding what types of things would appear in what types of spaces.
I thought the list of what's interesting in magazines that you provided, Jennifer, that they were willing to take stories that were startling, intriguing, lively. I mean, that's what they were looking for, and mischievous. Was wonderful, and that certainly is what would describe Diamond as Big as the Ritz, for example. Startling story in many ways. We do have a couple of questions now, one of which is, I was wondering this too, is from Kevin. How much of a say did Fitzgerald himself have in the pictures, in the illustrations? Did they send him sketches ahead and ask for his approval?
The answer to that, to quote an article written about Arthur William Brown, who was one of Fitzgerald's top illustrators, is no, and more 1,000 times no. So they were really pretty separate endeavors. You would have a literary editor and you would have an art editor, and so the art editor would assign stories to artists who had reputations in particular areas. So if someone were really good at a romance, they might get a romance sent to them. But once that happened, it was really up to the illustrators to decide what scenes to illustrate. There were stipulations. They knew how many. So generally, if it were the first story, especially by the end of the 20s, you would have 3 illustrations. Later stories sometimes only had 2 or 2 pages worth, but they might have a few small ones on both pages in the Post. And so they had that. They knew how many to make. They also knew that they were certain things they couldn't do, so they couldn't give away major plot points. They had to be careful about that. They knew that generally the first image was from somewhere earlier in the story. The second image was going to be the latest one that they illustrated, so from the latest in the story, and then the third was generally from somewhere in between those two. So they knew that kind of general idea. They knew where it basically would be placed on the page. So they did have those kinds of restrictions. And very importantly, they knew that they had to make sure that they didn't do anything in their illustration that took the reader out of the world the author had created. So they had to make sure that their details were accurate. Because if they misrepresented something, either because of the text or because they drew something improperly and the audience would know that's not what that looks like, then that would take them out of the text. Within that, though, the illustrators were in control. One of them said, because the art editor has too much to do, I can't go through and tell them. So they would pick what to illustrate. sometimes they would come in with a few different sketches and there would be a talk back and forth, but generally they would send it in and they might be asked to make a few revisions. Particularly at the post-mortem, sometimes would clear things up to make sure that it wasn't too risque. But very, very, very rarely did the author and the illustrator talk before the story came out. There is a very famous example that I write about in my Winter Dreams article where Fitzgerald was asked to send a letter to Arthur William Brown with some details about Winter Dreams, but it appears through researching that further that was Hovey, the editor's way of trying to get Fitzgerald to finish his story, because Brown got these suggestions and he didn't use any of them, not a single one. And this is further, I think, to further emphasize this point, Brown was illustrating the same story for two different magazines, for the Canadian version and for the American version. So he created 6 separate illustrations, none of which are Fitzgerald's suggestions. There's one that slightly, maybe, goes along with a similar idea, but it is not the same. And, on the other hand, Fitzgerald was very aware and appreciative of the illustrators and what they did, and he would write them notes after, frequently thanking them for their illustrations. Some of the ones that we showed, and even with his Reticent Witch, he ended up changing the ending of that story because he had seen the illustration that was going to accompany it, and he had been having trouble with the end of it, and seeing Raleigh's illustration of it helped him figure out how to finish it. So it did work that way, but
that's
not
fascinating. That is utterly fascinating. What occurs to me are 3 things. One is the pictures are such a high quality of art. I wonder if later, I've been to the to the Norman Rockwell Museum, and you see all the covers. Those are considered art, and mounted on the wall as art. Are these mounted anywhere separately? Are they shown anywhere separately? But they really are in themselves pieces of art. And the second thing is the way that the text often wraps itself, is wrapped around, the way the typesetter sort of encompasses the picture is wonderful. And not even the New Yorker does that. In fact, this is quite much more than what the New Yorker does with fiction, for example. And I don't know what other magazines today do it. And now this the way that Fitzgerald might get an idea from the illustration that he prompted in the first place. That's all really, really fascinating.
It really, people who study illustration think of it more as a composite text rather than as the text as one thing and the illustration is another, because when you think about the readers during that period, their experience of it was the two combined, just like we would with a comic book or a graphic novel today, right? It wasn't separate for them. And so, but to your question about the whether or not these are displayed, we had this on our final slide right now. For those of you in the DC area, they're doing a show on Jazz Age Illustration that has many of the illustrators who I work on, and will include some of the illustrations from Tender as the Night, in Delaware. It's at the Delaware Art Museum. I believe it started last weekend, goes through, I think, January. I'm participating in a symposium that they're doing in December on this. But if those of you in DC, you all know that Delaware, it's very easy to get to. Hop on the train up there. I think it would be well worth seeing. I've been talking to the curators about it. Looks fabulous. So highly, highly recommend that.
And you say you will be there in December. Did I understand that correctly?
I will be there in December. Yes.
So the field trip should be then. We should make our field trip. That's great. I want to bring in Alexandra. I don't see another story except about how you get this book in Australia. And of course, I'm eager to get it here in Washington in the paperback version. I assume that Amazon will be involved in the circulation of the book. And I want to go to a question for Alexandra.
You can get it. It'll certainly be on Amazon in paperback. I believe the hardback is as well.
Good. So, Alexandra, 183 stories. That to put through a sort of grinder of words, that's astonishing. And I'm so interested in the examples that you gave us. But I'm also interested in things that you didn't mention, and maybe you did study, things that are kind of obvious, like good sport, an expression like good sport, or the green light or something. How did you make a decision of what words to chart of all the words in all those 183 stories? And did you include those important, those ones that are important to people today, or not?
So in our volume, I've only done those engram analyses for the stories in this volume. So just for the 18 stories, not yet 183. And really, I looked up any word that just seemed a bit different from the way that we would use language today. There are some examples that I didn't show today because they're quite complicated, but I think that one that I'd like to maybe bring up now is an example from Dice, Brass Knuckles and Guitar, which is a story about a young man from the country trying to get in with the sophisticated city set. And you see that the sophisticates he's trying to impress are using the slang of the moment, that it almost is like those words like flapper and he-man, where at the time of writing, those words are at their peak. But the young man from the country, when he uses slang, it's a slang of about 7 years ago from the time of writing. That's something that we as modern readers don't really pick up on at all, because it's all just old words to us. But it really demonstrates how Fitzgerald was playing with and totally in control of the slang of his day. And I think that those are the most interesting examples, where you've got those two things, those two worlds in conflict.
Yes, the example of Jim in Dice,
yeah,
Brass Knuckles, and Guitar being really an interesting example of that. That's very interesting. So how many volumes do you expect what will this series be like when you finish? How many more volumes?
So we've calculated that it's a total of 7 volumes. So 1919 to 1920 sounds like a very short period, but it was obviously an incredibly creatively fecund period for Fitzgerald. And it was really the start of him not only selling a lot of his stories to magazines, but selling a lot of those magazine stories, selling the rights onto the movies as well. So it's a very commercially successful period for him. And the book will be of, I think, similar length to the 1921 to 1924 volume.
And will something like The Beautiful and the Damned be a separate volume, or will you do that, or just stick to the stories?
This project is really about the short stories. We've not discussed The Beautiful and Damned yet.
Well, that is an interesting question to me, since Kirk has a question, but let me throw this in first. The fact that he was working, I guess, simultaneously on these stories and the completion of that book, what crossovers do you see in terms of mood and tone between the novel that he's working on, which obviously he banked on for the continuation of his fame and high regard, and the stories that he didn't always place such high value on? Do you see echoes, a lot of echoes, or is that not part of your project at all, or you want to comment on that at all? Either of you.
I can start the answer to this one, Jennifer, and then if you want to pick it up, in our volume where we see echoes of Gatsby or echoes of The Beautiful and Damned, we do annotate that. So we do talk about how the story, when you read the footnotes, you see a little of how the stories became sort of ways that Fitzgerald was working out ideas for his novels. But our focus has really been on the magazine artifacts and the contemporary culture around them.
And there
I'm so
are, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
No, I was just going to say that there's already been a lot of scholarship on the Gatsby cluster stories, and some of the editions that are coming out now are actually including some of those along with Gatsby itself. So those projects are happening. They're just, our focus really is on that magazine context, and doing something different by taking the stories that maybe people don't think about together or at all and placing them next to some of his finest work and realizing that he's producing all of this at the same time.
And
it's not,
he's so young.
yes.
He's so young. That just is so astonishing. So Kirk has chimed in. This is a webinar, so you can't hear him, but I will read what he says, and of course you probably can read it too. He says, "What a great presentation. I'm curious about how we read Fitzgerald in periodicals alongside other writers. I don't mean famous ones like Faulkner, but the folks sort of lost to history. Maybe I'm biased," says Kirk, "but he seems so much better than those who surround him in the post. You guys, I will amend that to you women scholars, have so many great ideas about contextualizing the stories among ads, illustrations, and other evocations of popular culture in the works. Do you have any recommendations for what we do with competing writers? I feel the non-Fitzgerald humor in the post beyond hokey." You want to, Jennifer?
Well,
You
I
want to?
think so. First of all, something like the Post is going to have such a combination of different writers, of different, let's say, different types of skills. So there are other literary writers who are writing in the Post at this time. Like you mentioned, Faulkner eventually, more toward the end of the 20s, Sinclair Lewis, of course, Edith Wharton, right? I mean, these people are publishing there too. And then you've got people who are known for very different things. So someone like Mary Reinhardt, Robert Turner, I get that confused, who is known for her detective fiction, right? And I think that's the beauty of this. If what you want is a literary magazine, then you're probably better off going to, I don't know, maybe the Smart Set or, well, obviously the little magazines if you want high modernism. But what this is a snapshot of the popular culture of the time. And I think we see this, to go back to my earlier comparison, in our streaming services too. I mean, you will have some really high quality movies and television series alongside, 90 Day Fiance or whatnot. And it's that, I think it's that combination in some ways that makes it very interesting, because it gives us a glimpse into what the culture was like more broadly, rather than just the literary culture. And importantly, that literature was a central part of popular culture. And so we haven't focused, in some of the work that I do, I will look at things that are thematically similar, as I do with my work on Rags Martin Jones. But in terms of the, but I don't think so much it's the particular stories, as it is the fact that there are so many different types of stories for so many different types of readers, and that he was a really important contributor to this.
Yes.
I suppose that, Jennifer, you brought up the example of the smart set, but when you read The Diamond as Big as the Ritz and smart set on the same page, after that really strange and powerful story ends, there's just a weird little epigram about how you shouldn't get married. And it is like you've just finished Succession and suddenly a trailer for The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills starts rolling.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, so it is true that even in that space, you get that type of interlude, and I think to a modern audience, some of those interludes are actually quite offensive that were in this part set. But
I think of, I'm old enough that I remember the Saturday Evening Post, getting the Saturday Evening Post, and that was really like, I think in one part of your talk, Jennifer, you mentioned streaming today. It was something that we all shared culturally. Was when the Saturday Evening Post came, a lot of people were reading the same stories, and it was kind of a campfire around which to sit. Was a popular magazine like that, and you wouldn't notice then the strangeness of having a mouthwash ad close to a short story. But now it's fascinating to see what is what the ads are in relation to the stories. I don't see any other questions, but Gary, do you have anything you want to ask?
Well, yes, but there was a question about, does the book contain the story 2 for a Cent? Was that answered?
yes, I answered it I just cut and pasted the whole table of contents into the answered tab so that people could see everything that was in it. But yes, 2% is in it.
Okay.
So if you,
I have
I
a
was gonna,
very trivial question. I was intrigued by the 3 articles that were only available in the Library of Congress. And is there anything significant about them, where they were published? Is there any literary merit to them, or are they the worst things and therefore not collectible or online? Is there any comments to make about them?
So those 3 that are only in the Library of Congress are not in our volume. They're from the 1930s, and they are 3 of Fitzgerald's medieval stories. They are his Philippe stories. And I would say that those 3 are in the bottom 5 of the 183 that I've read.
they're
in the
printed
rare
now, of course, in West.
Yes, yeah.
So when you went to see them, are they in the rare book or in the periodical section, or where?
When I went to get them, they were just in periodicals.
And materially, you mentioned kind of ravaged.
They were a bit scuffed. Yeah, they were more scuffed than you might expect for something in a copyright library.
Yeah, that's distressing, isn't it? So the next volume, so we have these things to look forward to. The paperback is coming out very soon, and then you're going to be in the panel in December in Delaware. And then when does the next volume come out? How far along are you in the next volume?
So we'd expect that to be out in 2026.
So you've started it.
Yes, we have.
Any big surprises there in differences that you note?
I don't think that we can talk about yet, but Jennifer, you go ahead.
Well, so the magazine landscape that he's navigating, and what I'll be talking about with that, will focus primarily on the distinction between the smart magazines and the popular illustrated magazines, specifically the Smart Set and the Saturday Evening Post. But what I was talking about, how he was positioning himself originally through that distinction as he started. So that will be one difference. I will be expanding on that in the introduction.
Good. That will be interesting. I noticed going back to the story on 2 for a Cent, that only earned $900 at a time he was getting much more, but it was in the Metropolitan. It's interesting.
Yeah, Metropolitan was having a bit of a financial
Yeah.
situation there.
Yeah, very, very interesting. The other people I was interested in, Hearst himself, did he, I know there were editors under him, and then there were Mencken and Nathan and so forth. But I'm wondering, did Hearst himself take an interest in the publications in which, did he um, highlight or champion Fitzgerald at all?
That's complicated. So Ray Long was the head of the Hearst Empire at that time, and then Hovey was the editor at Hearst International, which is where Fitzgerald's stories were published. Hearst also owned Cosmopolitan, which notably never published a Fitzgerald story, although they published lots of Hemingway stories. So that's, the fact that they commissioned that or used that portrait of he and Zelda, and that so they did make a big announcement of it in Hearst International. That could be partly due to Carl Hovey's. So I think Hovey felt bad. He came over from Metropolitan, and Metropolitan, as I said before, went into receivership. And so I think Hovey liked Fitzgerald a lot. Ray Long notably did not like Fitzgerald very much. And so his work, I don't think he had a personal problem with him. And so I think Hovey was trying to help him out because what had happened with Metropolitan. Ironically, I think Fitzgerald would have done a lot better had he not taken that contract. So it's hard to parse out who was responsible for what, but I would guess that it was mainly Carl Hovey's choices because he was the editor, and the editor, would, just like Curtis. So the Saturday Evening Post and the Ladies' Home Journal were both under the Curtis Publishing Company, but the head of the Curtis Publishing Company wasn't really that involved by the 1920s in the day-to-day operations of either of those two. So I think it'd be the same with Hearst by that point.
Yeah. Well, Hearst was so powerful in every way in the culture that, it would have been interesting if he had particularly championed or not Fitzgerald. It's interesting. This has been a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. We do have a little more time. If there's anything that you took out of your talks that you want to put back in that would help us for when you come to Washington to guide us. I was thinking throughout of the role of a short story in a magazine. For example, Eudora Welty, Welty's stories, and these stories that are just long enough for waiting in a doctor's office. These stories are different. These are longer mostly, and they're not that kind of compressed. They're usually they're spun out over a greater period of time than some of the stories, like for example Eudora Welty's. But do you think that Fitzgerald had a sense when he was sending a story out of what the condition would be of the reader, where the reader would be? Would the reader be breathlessly waiting at home, or would the reader be at a checkout counter? Or what do you think he envisioned as his readership?
Well, you have to keep in mind, and this is one of the limitations of any print edition of the magazine stories, that the Saturday Evening Post was enormous. So it's not the kind of magazine that you could just easily take with you to the dentist, because it was so big.
Yeah, it
I
was.
think it really was more thought of as something that you would keep and read at home and that different people would use in your home just for that reason. Now, some of the other magazines were smaller. And of course, part of this has to do with money. The biggest cost still today for magazines is paper. And so if you make a smaller format, it costs less. So if you can afford to have the big format, like the Post could because of all their advertising, you have to have money to pay for that. So that's a privilege in a way that the Post had. But yeah, so I don't think I think the reason that the Post did tend to publish these lengthier stories is because they weren't thinking that it was going to be something that people were necessarily carrying around as often, because it just would have been a lot harder to do given how large it was.
I love the definition that Edith Wharton had of a short story, of a shaft driven into the heart of an experience, which I don't think quite fits a Fitzgerald story. A Fitzgerald story is, would you say, a more expansive, on the way to becoming a novella sometimes event. It's not
Well,
that
certainly Mayday,
first.
right? I mean, he certainly has some that are novellas. Yeah, and he's not. I do think because of where he was, at least the Post, where he was publishing, he did have a little more room to with how many words he used and to play with that. Um, it does read very differently, even than someone like Faulkner, right? Who you said that the short story was the hardest form to write because you had every word mattered. So I don't know if that answered what you were asking, but
We have someone who's just made himself known, or herself, Nacho from Spain, where I just published a critical edition of his essays. So, of course, I hope that Nacho and anybody else who's on this is planning to come to New York for the big conference. And I hope you're coming, both of you, and that
oh
I'll see
yes.
you there. Yes, those are always such fantastic events. This has been really a wonderful evening for me, and I am uh, very eager. I got the Jackson's assignment too late to get your book, but I am definitely getting it, and I'm fascinated by all the material that I have read on it, and by the whole idea, Alexandra, of what could be done with. I'm an Emily Dickinson person. My goodness, somebody has to get started with that and start those charts, because that would be an utterly new way to read anybody, and in any genre, any form. So, I mean, Wallace Stevens, for example, how would you ever go after the language in somebody like that? It's just a fascinating, complete new world that your technology has opened up. And Jennifer, your scholarship on these stories and your knowledge of all these various intermediary people between Fitzgerald and the reader, I think that's really fascinating uh, to read about. And I will look forward to the second volume in 26. But before that, I will have seen you. I think our time is just about over. Gary, do you want to? Well, I asked you a question, then I didn't allow time. Is there one leftover little tidbit, humorous or frustrating or dreamlike, that you want to throw in before we say goodnight?
I think that we just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and look forward, as Ellie said, to seeing as many of you as possible in New York next year.
Yes.
Yes. Likewise, I want to say the same. It's going to be a great conference, and we hope to have lots and lots of people there to celebrate Gatsby and his other works. Well,
It's a
next
very
summer.
big Fitzgerald year coming up.
Yes, indeed.
Very big. It's great. Well, thank you to all of our, there's one more. Such a great break from bad weather and politics. Yes, that's a good way to go out. It's been, I would love, by the way, so many things that you said did have political resonances. And I mean, the fact that you were looking at the phrase He-Man, definitely something political there. But this has also been a good break. It reminds us of where we are today, and it takes us away both at the same time. So it's been great. And I thank you very, very much. And on behalf of Jackson, who's very sorry, I know that he didn't get to do this and he would have done it so much better to talk to you, but I know he's very sorry that something very important came up and he couldn't not go. So I was lucky enough to do it. Thank you very much. And Gary, I guess you're the one who has to officially say goodnight.
Well, I can say that, and with a big thank you. And I also want to say that we look forward to the second volume and having you back in 25 or 26 whenever it is appropriate. So we'll look forward to that.
All right, thank you very much.
It's a great enterprise, great production.
Good night, all.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.